Sometimes the biggest stories, the ones that really make headlines, they come down to these really fundamental human rights issues.
Mm.
Um, I'm thinking about Gavin Grimm.
Ah, yeah. The young transgender man. He just wanted to use the boys' bathroom at his high school. Right.
Exactly. And that request, which seems so simple, it turned into this huge 6-year legal fight against his school board.
It did, and it ended with a pretty significant settlement, too. I think it was $1.3 million, because the court found the school board had violated his rights under Title IX, under the Constitution.
Yeah. And Laverne Cox had this quote about it when she heard the ruling. She just said, I got goosebumps. And
Wow.
that tells you, this wasn't just some administrative thing. It was about recognition, really.
And that idea, that struggle for recognition, that's really our mission today for you, the listener. We've put this deep dive together for. We want to go beyond, the simple definitions you might see floating around. We're going to dig into the psychological research to unpack the relationship between biology, society, and identity. And importantly, challenge some of those persistent biases that just make everything so complicated.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. Build a solid foundation. Because our brains, they categorize identity super fast, but the research, it shows the reality is, well, it's way more complex. We need to get 3 core terms straight first.
Okay, first up is sex. This is about the biological stuff. Assigned at birth based on chromosomes like XX or XY, gonads, hormones, genitals. The physical package, basically.
Got it. Biological starting point. Then number 2 is gender.
Right. Gender is more about the social and cultural side of things. It's the roles, the behaviors, the expectations that society kind of attaches to being masculine or feminine.
Okay, so sex is biology, gender is society. What's the third one?
The third, and maybe the most personal, is gender identity. This is internal. It's a person's deeply felt personal sense of being a man or a woman, or maybe both, or neither, or somewhere else entirely. It's how you feel inside, regardless of the sex assigned at birth.
Okay, that's clear. Sex, gender, gender identity. So let's dive back into that biological starting point. Sex, you mentioned it gets really interesting there.
Yeah, it does, because the raw materials, the biological foundation for both male and female characteristics, they're actually the same in an early embryo.
Really? So how does the differentiation happen?
Well, the default pathway, embryonically speaking, is female. To develop typically male characteristics, you need something specific to happen. The SRY gene on the Y chromosome has to get activated and work properly.
Okay.
That gene kicks off the development of testes, and then those testes produce androgens, hormones that shape male development. Without that SRY activation, the female pathway continues.
But even that biological piece, the XXXY thing, it's not always so clear-cut, is it?
Not at all. Absolutely not. And this is where we need to talk about differences of sexual development, or DSD. These used to be called intersex conditions. These are conditions where someone's born with sex characteristics, chromosomes, gonads, or anatomy that don't fit the typical definitions of male or female. Like Turner syndrome, maybe, where someone has just one X chromosome, 45, XCO, or Klinefelter syndrome with XXY chromosomes, 47, XXY. Biology isn't just 2 neat boxes.
And these biological variations, they kind of force us to look at that whole nature versus nurture debate, especially the tragic history there, like the David Reimer case, John Joan.
Oh, that case is just heartbreaking. And scientifically deeply problematic. Researchers basically tried to prove that gender identity was all nurture, all socialization.
How did they do that?
After a terrible surgical accident during his circumcision, they surgically altered his male genitals to look female and then raised him as a girl, believing that social input, the nurture, would determine his identity.
But it didn't work out that way at all.
Yeah. No. David experienced immense distress, rejected the female identity they tried to impose, and later transitioned back to living as a male. Sadly, he died by suicide later in life. It was a profound failure, really, of that purely socialization theory.
Such a stark reminder that, biology and that internal sense of self are incredibly powerful factors.
Exactly. And if you look at the current expert consensus, it's shifted dramatically. The focus now is rightly on the child's well-being and their future autonomy. The UN has even condemned performing medically unnecessary cosmetic surgeries on infants with DSD.
And we see better outcomes when that autonomy is respected, right?
Yeah.
Like with Ori Turner.
Yes, that's a great example. Ori was born with ambiguous genitalia, and their parents chose to wait to give Ori space to figure things out. Ori eventually identified as non-binary. It just shows the importance of respecting that inner sense of self.
Okay, so that respect for the internal experience is key. That kind of leads us into the social layer again, gender. Society has these expectations, these stereotypes about traits, right?
hmm We often talk about instrumentality traits like being assertive, independent, stereotypically masculine, and then expressiveness being nurturing, warm, sensitive, stereotypically feminine.
And interestingly, the research suggests that people who score high on both who are androgynous actually tend to have higher psychological well-being.
That's right. Balance seems to be healthier than rigidly sticking to one pole or the other.
Which is fascinating because society pushes so hard for rigidity, for the gender binary, this idea that there are only two distinct opposite categories, man and woman.
Exactly. But here's where the brain research just throws a wrench in that whole binary idea.
Oh, how so? I think most people still sort of assume there are male brains and female brains, distinct structures.
Yeah, that's the common assumption. But the science, it's really not bearing that out. The organ that's most involved in our psychological experience, the brain, it doesn't neatly conform to a binary.
What do you mean?
Researchers looking at brain scans find that most brains are actually mosaics. They have a mix of features, some more common in males, some more common in females, and some common to both. Regardless of how masculine or feminine someone feels or acts, their brain is likely androgynous structurally and functionally.
Wow. So the very center of our psychological selves, our brain, doesn't really fit the two-box system society tries to impose.
Pretty much. It fundamentally challenges that binary.
Which makes total sense then, psychologically, that we see gender identities existing beyond just cisgender, where someone's identity aligns with the sex they were assigned at birth.
Precisely. It helps explain the growing visibility and understanding of identities like non-binary. That's an umbrella term for people who identify outside that man-woman dichotomy. It includes folks who are agender, genderqueer, gender fluid, lots of possibilities.
And there are significant numbers of people identifying this way now.
Yeah, estimates suggest over 1 million people in the U.S. identify as non-binary. And then there's transgender, where a person's gender identity differs from the sex assigned at birth. That's nearly 2 million people in the U.S.
Okay, so this leads us to a really important and sometimes controversial area, gender-affirming care, especially for young people. Specifically, things like puberty blockers. What does the psychological research actually say about them?
The scientific consensus here is actually very clear. Puberty blockers are considered safe, and crucially, they are reversible.
Reversible. Okay, that's important.
They essentially press pause on the permanent physical changes of puberty, like a voice deepening or breast development. This gives the young person valuable time, a sort of timeout, to explore their identity without the distress of undergoing irreversible body changes they don't want.
And what are the outcomes associated with access to this kind of care?
The research consistently shows positive outcomes. Access to puberty blockers and other affirming care is linked to significantly lower risks of depression and suicide and higher overall well-being for transgender youth.
That's incredibly important data. Now, despite all this growing understanding about identity and the brain, bias still creeps in, doesn't it? Even in surprising places. You mentioned an example from veterinary medicine.
Yes, this study was really striking. Researchers gave clinic managers identical performance reviews. The catch was one was attributed to Mark and the other to Elizabeth.
Okay. And these were managers in veterinary medicine, where women are actually the majority now, right?
That's the kicker. Yes, women are well represented, even dominant in the field. But the managers, including the female managers, rated Mark as significantly more competent and suggested paying him almost $4,000 more than Elizabeth for the exact same work described in the file.
Wait, $4,000 more? How is that even possible if women are largely in charge? Doesn't representation solve the bias?
Apparently not automatically. And here's the truly fascinating part. The managers who were most likely to show this bias were the ones who strongly believed that gender bias wasn't really a problem in their field anymore.
Wow. So believing you're unbiased can actually make you more biased.
It seems that way sometimes, that belief in your own objectivity can mask the unconscious biases that are still operating. It's a huge hurdle.
That is, yeah, incredibly powerful. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Can we quickly touch on the main psychological theories about how gender develops, just to cover the main approaches?
Sure. Broadly speaking, there are 4 main perspectives psychologists have used. There's the biological view, focusing on genes, hormones, brain structure. Then evolutionary psychology, which often talks about sexual selection, the idea that males compete and females choose, leading to different strategies and traits.
Okay. Biological, evolutionary. What else?
Third is the social cognitive view. This emphasizes learning how kids learn gender roles through rewards, punishments, and observing others. And they develop these internal mental guides, called gender schemas, about what's appropriate for their gender.
And the fourth.
Social role theory. This one argues that the historical division of labor, men doing certain kinds of work, women doing others, is what created many of the gender differences and stereotypes we see.
That's interesting because it suggests that as society's roles change, the gender differences should shrink.
Exactly. And that leads beautifully into a really important finding by Janet Shibley-Hyde. She did massive meta-analyses, combining data from hundreds of studies.
And what did she find?
Her conclusion is called the gender similarities hypothesis. Basically, across most psychological variables, cognitive abilities, personality traits, communication styles, men and women are much more similar than they are different. The overlaps are huge.
So despite all the cultural focus on differences, the data mostly shows similarities. Are there any areas where differences are consistently found?
Yes, one area where differences do tend to show up consistently is aggression.
Ah, okay. How so?
Men, on average, tend to exhibit higher levels of overt aggression that's physical or direct verbal harm. But for girls and women, relational aggression, things like spreading rumors, social exclusion, damaging someone's relationships or social standing, tends to make up a larger proportion of their total aggressive behavior.
Interesting distinction. Okay, let's talk about another stereotype. Casual sex. The idea that men are just inherently way more interested in it than women. That old Clark and Hatfield study comes to mind.
Ah, yes, the 1989 campus study,
Right.
where attractive Confederates walked up to students of the opposite sex and asked, "Would you go to bed with me tonight?"
Right, and the results were stark, weren't they?
Oh, yeah. About 75% of the men said yes, and literally 0% of the women said yes. Seems like pretty clear evidence for that stereotype.
It does seem like it, but then, decades later, Garrett Conley's research threw a massive wrench into that interpretation. What was the big issue that Conley found in that original study?
It was almost deceptively simple. The gender of the person asking the question. Women in the study were always being propositioned by an unknown male stranger.
Ah, so safety concerns immediately come into play.
Exactly, stranger danger. Women weren't necessarily rejecting casual sex per se. They were likely rejecting the potential danger and awkwardness of sex with a complete male stranger who just walked up to them. It wasn't a level playing field.
So it wasn't really measuring interest in casual sex accurately, but more like risk assessment.
Precisely. And Conley's later studies supported this. When you remove or reduce the safety awkwardness factor, like asking women if they'd sleep with a trusted, attractive friend or even a famous celebrity, their willingness goes way up. It shows that context and safety are huge factors, not just some innate difference in desire.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. And there's another layer too, right? The idea of the quality of sex. Are men and women even rating the same kind of experience when they report interest?
That's a really provocative question. Think about the ravioli analogy someone used. If the cultural script for sex primarily defaults to penile vaginal intercourse,
That specific act statistically results in orgasm more reliably for men than for women.
right. Studies show women having sex with women report much higher orgasm consistency. There are other factors too, like maybe less early experience with masturbation for girls, which research links to better orgasm outcomes later, plus the sexual double standard, risk of pregnancy.
So if the typical experience is potentially less satisfying, riskier, and more stigmatized for one group,
It makes sense their expressed interest might be lower, even if the underlying capacity for desire isn't fundamentally different. It's likely more about culture, experience, and mechanics than some fixed biological drive.
Okay, moving on from gender now.
Yeah.
Let's talk about attraction itself, sexual orientation. The direction of someone's romantic and erotic interests. We know this can be fluid, right?
Mm.
Especially for younger women sometimes.
Yes, fluidity is definitely part of the picture for some people. And we have terms to describe different patterns. Heterosexual, attracted to the different sex gender, gay lesbian, attracted to the same sex gender, and bisexual, attracted to more than one sex gender, which is actually the most common identity among people with diverse orientations.
And there are other identities too.
Pansexual, which often means attraction regardless of a person's sex or gender identity, and asexual, which describes people who experience little or no sexual attraction to others.
Now, it's really important we address the outdated myths about what causes someone's sexual orientation. What does the science say doesn't cause it?
Right. The research is clear. Sexual orientation is not determined by things like having a specific type of parent.
Yeah.
Most gay people have heterosexual parents. It's not about being recruited or modeling. And early childhood sexual experimentation doesn't predict adult orientation either.
So what does influence it? Is there a gay gene?
No single gay gene has been found. It seems to be a complex interplay of factors. There's evidence for genetic influences. Multiple genes likely contribute small effects, along with potential hormonal influences during prenatal development, and possibly other biological and environmental factors we don't fully understand yet. It's complex.
Okay, let's pivot to more practical health aspects, sex education. There's often debate between comprehensive sex education and abstinence-only approaches. What does the data show works better?
The data here is overwhelmingly conclusive. Comprehensive sex education is far superior for health outcomes.
What does comprehensive ed involve?
It provides accurate information about anatomy, reproduction, birth control, condom use for preventing STIs, healthy relationships, consent. And it usually encourages delaying sexual activity, but prepares young people for if and when they do become sexually active.
And the results?
Critically, comprehensive sex ed does not lead to increased sexual activity, despite what some critics claim. But it does lead to reduced rates of unplanned pregnancies and sexual transmitted infections.
And abstinence-only program?
Yes. They typically emphasize avoiding sex outside of marriage, often present negative views of sexuality, and sometimes provide inaccurate information about contraception failure rates. The research shows they generally fail to significantly delay the start of sexual activity and don't reduce behaviors that risk HIV infection.
So the evidence strongly favors comprehensive programs for actual public health.
Unequivocally.
And a key part of any good sex education and just healthy sexuality in general has to be consent, right?
Absolutely essential. And the standard we should all be aiming for is affirmative consent.
What does that mean exactly?
It means getting a clear, unambiguous, knowing, and voluntary indication of willingness through words or actions before and during any sexual activity. It's not about the absence of a no, it's about the presence of an enthusiastic yes. Anything less isn't truly consent.
Got it. Okay, to wrap things up, let's connect sexuality back to overall well-being. Does how often people have sex matter for relationship satisfaction?
It does seem to matter, yeah, but maybe not in the way people think. Research suggests that sexual frequency is linked to higher relationship satisfaction, but only up to a certain point.
Oh, what's the magic number?
Well, it seems like the benefit kind of levels off at about once a week. Having sex more often than that doesn't seem to be associated with significantly greater well-being or satisfaction on average.
Interesting. Once a week seems to be the sweet spot for that connection.
Yeah. And there's also this cool finding about a sexual afterglow.
Ooh, tell me more.
It's this feeling of heightened satisfaction and connection that can apparently last for up to 48 hours after sex. And studies suggest that experiencing this afterglow predicts better long-term marital satisfaction. So it shows that intimacy has this lingering positive impact.
That's a lovely finding. Okay, so to recap this whole deep dive for you, our listener,
we started with the idea that sex assigned at birth isn't always simple, looking at DSD and the cautionary tale of the John Jones case. We saw how gender is socially constructed, but also how the brain itself seems to defy a strict binary, being more like an androgynous mosaic.
Right. And we saw how unconscious bias can persist even when we think it's gone, like in that vet study.
Right.
We looked at similarities often outweighing differences between genders, except maybe in types of aggression.
And we challenged stereotypes, like the idea that men just want casual sex more, showing how safety and context matter hugely. We talked about the quality of sexual experience potentially differing.
We defined different sexual orientations, debunked myths about causes, and saw the clear data supporting comprehensive sex ed and affirmative consent. And finally, linked sexuality to well-being, finding that weekly sweet spot and the lovely afterglow.
So the big takeaway is that our understanding of sex, gender, and sexuality is deeply tangled up with psychology, biology, and culture. It constantly pushes back against overly simple assumptions.
Which leads us to a final thought for you to consider. If we accept social role theory's idea that many gender differences come from learned roles and expectations,
then how might changing the very language we use about sex and relationships make a difference?
Yeah. If we consciously move away from those old gendered assumptions, who's supposed to pursue, who's supposed to choose, all that stuff, could that help reduce gender bias even further in our society?
Something to think about. Maybe start noticing today in conversations and media how subtle language choices still reinforce those old stereotypes, because noticing is often the first step toward change.